What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so I want to jump into the Flash War Prelude, Flash Annual #1. For those of you guys who don't know, when it comes to comic books, annuals kind of take different forms. We've talked about this before. It used to be that annuals were just kind of there. It was just kind of like a filler story. And it was usually isolated from everything else that was going on. You would have like a main story arc, and then it would get around to where we have 5 weeks in a month instead of 4 weeks in a month or something weird along those lines. Basically like 5 Wednesdays rather, as opposed to 4. And they just kind of need like a filler story. And so what they do is they just throw in a random, annual, and usually it's for like up and coming writers and artists, the ability for those guys to kind of make their bones, show off what they're capable of and that kind of a thing. But that's really about it. What this does is it actually kind of breaks that trend, which is something that's been going on for really a couple decades, if we're going to be honest with ourselves. Annuals have really sort of evolved from like that old hat format to basically being like, tied into a lot of the ongoing stories. And this one really fleshes out, or at least brings us the prelude to Flash War. Of course, Flash War basically being an event that's going to see all the Flashes, quote unquote, going to war with each other. But this initially picks up in the 25th century after the events of Running Scared. Now, for those of you guys who aren't familiar with that, Running Scared was a story that we did where we basically dealt with the idea of the retold origin of Eobard Thawne, of the Reverse Flash, in the sense that instead of him just kind of being a guy who idolized the Flash and then went back into the past and realized he was destined to become Reverse Flash and it kind of drove him insane, instead it was the idea that he and Barry shared a very personal moment when Barry traveled to the 25th century and met Eobard Thawne for the first time. And where Barry trained Eobard to use his powers and so on and so forth, when Eobard went back to the modern day, he saw Barry sharing that same moment, or I guess went back to the past rather, he saw Barry sharing that same moment with Wally West, and the result was that he felt betrayed and became a villain. But the fact remains here that in the aftermath of that story Running Scared, which basically saw Iris West just kind of like dispersing the atoms of, Eobard Thawne all over the place using some kind of a ray gun, what this did is it set in motion the idea that people wanted to know what was going on. And what we ended up having was this group that was basically kind of tasked with tracking down Barry, basically traveling to the past, tracking down Barry, and then quote unquote arresting him. And this group was essentially tasked by like a masked man. We didn't really know who he was. But following this, we actually kind of, jump back to the modern age right now and basically pick up with a guy called the Top. Now, the Top was never a huge character in the realm of DC Comics. He was one of the small time guys. The overall gist is that he could basically create like these massive bursts of wind and spin things and so on and so forth, much like a Top, like you would expect with that whole ideology. He was a John Broome, Carmine Infantino creation, I think. But the whole idea behind this is that he's just kind of there wreaking havoc, and then that's really about it. And the result is that we end up having, Barry and Wally West, and then the young New 52 Wally West, they all just kind of team up and they basically defeat Top, and then that's really about it. But from here, this is when things really start to focus on Wally, because that's kind of the nature of this. Remember, when it comes to the classic Wally West, the red-haired Wally West, for the most part, despite the fact that he's back in DC Rebirth, there hasn't really been a whole lot of time spared to really deal with like how he's coping with the situation. We've seen small little bits here and there. We really saw it a lot in like the DC Universe Rebirth one-shot and like the Flash Aftermath story. But for the most part, a lot of the stories that have been told by DC regarding, classic Wally West have been told in a way that just kind of acclimates him to going back to the Titans, getting in contact again with Barry Allen, that kind of a thing, kind of going back to being a superhero. And it's cool because it's actually just sort of a slow build. It's a slow burn. And that's the best way to tell stories in my book. The best way to tell it is to kind of let it grow organically. And when they sit down at a taco stand, Wally kind of like harkens back to, when he was younger and he used to come here with Iris West all the time. And so it's kind of cool because it hits back at these small moments with his character. What we also end up finding out here is that what Barry Allen had done is that with the whole scenario with the Top, where that battle had basically finished and then Iris West had seemingly come running out of nowhere in order to basically interview classic Wally West, we end up finding out Barry engineered that. He didn't engineer the actions of the Top. He basically tipped off Iris West to what was going on so that she would show up and she would confront Wally. And the reason why is, remember, Wally's out of time here to a degree, or at least it kind of seems that way. Remember, when it comes to DC Rebirth, the kind of standard chronology in terms of how most people accept it is that you had the classic DC timeline, and then you had the events of Flashpoint, and things were supposed to go back to normal after the events of Flashpoint, but Dr. Manhattan stepped in. And what it meant was that Wally West was kind of forgotten. He was sort of locked in the Speed Force, and it was a way for DC to explain why he wasn't there. And so with classic Wally coming back, for the most part, everything's different from from the way he remembers. Linda Park Park doesn't remember him. Iris West doesn't remember him. For the most part, they don't really know each other. And these are pretty big moments because remember, Linda Park was the girlfriend of Wally West and then eventually his wife, and they had kids together. So when Wally thinks about Linda Park, the Linda Park that he remembers a family. He remembers them basically making a life for themselves, settling down, that kind of a thing. But when he's thrust into this current landscape for DC Comics, none of this stuff is going on. And so it's him trying to deal with things. Now, where he should actually go through and talk to Iris and reveal his identity and tell her everything he knows, where he should go find Linda Park, and even if nothing happens, basically say, hey, look, these are the things that I remember, although that would be kind of creepy. But the bigger picture here and the bigger gist of this is that Wally kind of takes it as an affront. Now, he takes it offensively for a couple of reasons. Wally's coming from the standpoint of, well, Iris wouldn't be able to handle this. Like, if I told Iris everything that's going on, she wouldn't be able to grasp it. And the whole idea of Barry is, but dude, like, she destroyed Eobard Thawne. I promise she can handle herself. Like, she can handle this whole situation. But for Wally, it's not that simple. And even then, it's one of those things where, okay, even if she could, of what business is it of yours? And that brings in the direct, juxtaposition of like Wally versus Barry, the philosophical differences between the two. But it is kind of intriguing because in this whole conversation that they have, this whole argument that they have, they kind of race a little bit and then they stop, and Barry's like, hey, look, man, don't make me chase you. And Wally simply says, look, if I wanted to run away from you, there's no way you could stop me. And that's true. One thing to keep in mind, this is one of the reasons why a lot of classic fans of The Flash love classic Wally West, is because when it comes down to like the hierarchy of the fastest speedsters, Wally West is the fastest Flash. He's faster than Barry Allen. That's the way this whole thing with the Flash mythos works, is for a time, all you had were like these disconnected speedsters. You had like Johnny Chambers and Jesse Chambers that discovered a formula. They gave him super speed, and when they said the formula, they gained their powers. You had Jay Garrick, who was exposed to heavy water, whatever it is, and he inhaled those gases, and suddenly he could run at the speed of sound. And then you had Max Mercury, and you had all these different characters who were able to tap into the Speed Force. It wasn't, or I guess really gain superpowers. It wasn't until Terminal Velocity by Mark Waid that they were all unified, that it was all, hey, this formula that Johnny and Jesse Chambers say, the heavy water, whatever it was that Jay Garrick inhaled, what it did is it all allowed them by one measure over another to tap into the Speed Force. And so that's how they all gain their powers. But where Wally West is the fastest because he directly mainlines the Speed Force, meaning he draws directly off of it, Barry Allen was the one who made it. And so that's how all these different characters sort of fit in. So it's a pretty cool moment when it comes down to these characters, because it's just kind of like, hey, look, I don't necessarily need you anymore. Because remember, when it comes to classic Wally West, when he first became the Flash, Crisis on Infinite Earths happens, the story ends, Wally West ages up, Barry Allen's dead, and then he's, kind of stuck under Barry's shadow for a little while. And then under the writing of like Mark Waid and all those guys, it was basically kind of taking him out of that shadow and making him his own superhero. And so because of that, Wally just kind of grew into his own character. It's really kind of interesting with regards to this whole argument between these two guys. But the fact remains, when Wally sits down and kind of thinks about the various people that might remember him or don't really remember him per se, the whole question is, who is it that would remember him? Of all the people who were out there, who would recall his existence? And he thinks back to a girl by the name of Frances Kane that he grew up with. Now, Frances Kane was introduced back in 1982 by Marv Wolfman and George Perez, and she was a Teen Titans character. The way this whole thing worked out is much like Chris Claremont with the X-Men, where he was just like creating all different kinds of mutants and then just throwing them into the stories and seeing how people responded. Wolfman and Perez, during their kind of iconic run on the Teen Titans, had done very much the exact same thing. The idea was just make it, throw it in the story, send it out. If fans love it, keep it. If they don't, get rid of it. And so what you ended up having with Frances Kane is she was basically a girl who, grew up with Wally. She was his Lana Lang, so to speak. For those of you guys who don't know, Lana Lang is basically the girl that first realized that Clark Kent had powers, taught him how to use his powers, and really kind of set the stage for Clark to become Superman later on, in addition to Jonathan and Martha Kent. But the whole idea was that she was alongside the Teen Titans for a little while. She kind of, worked with the team, but ultimately ended up just kind of walking away. And there was a lot of romance between herself and Wally West. And in fact, ultimately they just kind of ended up breaking up and going their own separate ways. But there was a point whereby I believe she was trying to find a way to get rid of her powers, or at least hone her powers of magnetism or something like that. But she ended up encountering a scientist who kind of twisted her mind, and then she basically developed a split personality. But that's basically what happens here. Wally shows up and then just kind of starts talking to her and says, hey, look, I don't know if you know me, I don't know if you're familiar with me, but here's who I am, and I remember you when you were younger, and that kind of a thing. And then suddenly she starts to remember who he is. Now this works. That goes all the way back to DC Universe Rebirth #1. That's how he came back, was going to Barry Allen, visiting as many people as he could, anybody that knew him when he was a superhero, and then finally comes across Barry and says, you have to remember me. And at the last minute, Barry remembers him and Wally West is back. So that's kind of the shtick of his character at the moment, is he kind of travels around to people who have seemingly forgotten him and kind of quote unquote wakes up their memories. And so it is cool because basically she recalls everything about them. The fact that they were friends, the fact that they dated for a while, there was a romance, and then immediately the magenta personality kicks in and she loses it. She just starts attacking him with everything she can get a hold of. But it is funny and it is really intriguing because it's him kind of having to come back and cope with his own demons, you know, cope with the mistakes that he made in the past, the kind of things that he was involved in, all that kind of good stuff. For the most part, while he wants to spill the beans, in truth, with her being a villain, she's really the only one he can really confide in at the moment, or at least feels like he can confide in. Wally West is really just a prisoner of his own mind. He's just kind of locked in this cycle for himself. You know, it's not that he went to Iris and she rebuked him, it's that he's afraid to because maybe she won't remember him. And that's kind of the fearful thing about this, is that if you're Wally West and you say, okay, so like Barry Allen remembers me and like the Titans remember me, but like Iris West may not remember me, that'd be the most crushing thing because that's his aunt. That's like one of the closest people that he has. And to suddenly find out that she doesn't remember anything about him, she doesn't recall him at all, it would be devastating. And so it's almost one of those things where it's easier to just not ask than to basically get the worst kind of answer. And so what ends up happening here is where the magenta personality begins to settle down and Wally's able to kind of talk some sense back into Frances Kane, sort of bring that persona back out. This brings her character back. And so it really kind of teases the possibility that things could go one of two ways. If Wally has to choose between Linda Park and Frances Kane, which one will he choose? Now, depending on where you stand with the Flash comics, you could go either way. There are people who are classic fans that are like, nope, I want to see him marry Linda Park and I want to see them have Jai and Iris West and I want to see them like as younger kids, you know, and I want to see them be like a Flash family again. You know, classic Wally West fans would love to see that come back. But then some people are kind of like, yeah, but I mean, like, we've done that dance before. And so that's what people are kind of curious about. They're like, well, if we got Frances Kane, that changes everything because now Wally West has to deal with a girlfriend who's crazy as hell, but like, it's also a chick he dated at one point along the line. And so what you end up having is Wally sort of coming to grips with things. You know, is Wally basically saying, look, to this point in my life, I have been in this situation where I am in this, you know, this rebirth landscape. It's not the place that I remember. And I've effectively kind of kept myself shunted off. I've used the events of like fighting alongside the Titans. I've used the events of fighting alongside the Flash to effectively shy away from that part of my life and avoid it all. And so what he needs to do, at least, you know, from his perspective, is to basically sit down and say, I have to come to grips with where I am right now. I have to come to grips with like where my life is at the moment. The longer he goes without talking to Linda Park, the least likely the opportunity is that they'll ever get together. Because if we're talking about, you know, something legitimate, she'll just find a guy and eventually settle down. But if Wally West steps in and says, hey, look, you know, let's get a cup of coffee. I really need to talk to you about something. And I know it's going to sound crazy as hell, but hear me out. If it sparks memories and she remembers who he is, suddenly everything comes rolling back in again. That's the risk. It's kind of like this in comic book adaptation of the nature of love. Sure, ask a girl out, get your heart broken, and that happens 1,000 times. But then you ask a girl out, she says yes, and you're married 4 years later. So, you know, it's one of those things where it's just kind of like, you never know how it's going to work out. You just got to give it a shot. You got to throw it out there and just kind of see what happens. And so where he ultimately kind of, you know, goes back to his position and really kind of says, look, I got to go back with the Flash family. You know, I'm as much a part of this as Barry Allen as anybody else. We end up jumping back to the 25th century. And as we go through this, we end up finding out that, again, this guy is basically going through and tasking a group called the Renegades, which is kind of like the 25th century version of like the Rogues. You've got guys like Mirror Monarch and Commander Cold, but where that group is tasked with going back and essentially capturing Barry Allen, what we end up finding out is this group has actually been sent back by Hunter Zolomon. And this is cool. This is really interesting because as far as I'm aware, we have not seen Hunter Zolomon yet in DC Rebirth. And this begs the question, are we going to go with like his old school origin, where he's basically almost identical to Barry Allen in the sense that his parents, you know, never really, well, his parents never got along. Barry Allen's parents got along fine. Okay, so not exactly like Barry, but Hunter's parents didn't really get along too well. It turned out his father was a serial killer. His mom was going to turn him in. The father of Hunter killed his mom, and then he was arrested, or I guess he was really killed by the cops when everything popped off and he refused to surrender. And then basically had his legs broken, and then, you know, I guess, you know, was paralyzed, and then broke into like the Flash Museum and tried to use a cosmic treadmill, and then like it displaced him from the timeline. We might just do like a Hunter Zolomon explained video or something along those lines in anticipation for Flash War. I don't know. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.